What a great group. Wow, you guys, I have to tell you, a few years ago, I went crazy. I was working full-time, I was in school full-time, and I decided that was my year to do a triathlon. Not just any triathlon, no, because I'm not an underachiever. I decided to do an Ironman. Anybody else out there ever done an Ironman? Any hands up? I'll tell you what, folks, fewer than 0.1% of the world's population has done an Ironman distance event. So if you saw any hands go up, be sure to give them a high five when you're out and about at the conference. If you don't know what an Ironman is, let me just tell you quickly. Flip that slide. It's a 2.4-mile swim, followed by a 112-mile bike ride, and then a 26.2-mile run, a full marathon, all in one day, and they don't stop for lunch. You just go until you're done. Well, you're finance people, you might be doing the math in your head. That's a total of 140.6 miles, all in one day. And did I mention I was working full-time and I was in school full-time? I had two clients. One was going through an ICD-10 conversion, and I had never been that deep in codes before. I got to tell you, that was an education. The other client I was working with that year was the Department of Veterans Affairs in the claims area, a very complex and challenging environment, and doing incredibly important work. And I was writing my dissertation, and I had set up a pretty challenging research agenda that I was having trouble getting started on, just wasn't getting done. So it was a bit of a crazy year. I could tell you a lot of stories about that year, but that's actually a different talk altogether. What I'd like to share with you quickly is something that actually happened during the event itself. I got there in the morning, I did my swim, I was feeling strong, which was good, because my goal in a triathlon is always don't drown. If I don't drown, I think I've done a good job. So people say, well, what kind of time do you want to get? And I say, I just don't want to drown. I just want to get out of the water. So I actually did that, and I was feeling pretty good, and I went and I got on my bike, and I started to ride. Now, something happens in an endurance event. You start to settle in around the same people. They're around the same fitness, around the same speed as you, and you see them over and over again. It makes sense, right? You also see their supporters on the side of the road. I had 5 girlfriends there. They were cheering us on. Every time I saw them, my pedals would turn a little faster. There was someone in the group around me who had about 20 supporters, and they were phenomenal. They were out there every few miles cheering us all on. And at first we went by them, and I thought, oh, that's great. Somebody's got a lot of fans here. But then I noticed they were all waving signs. And the signs all said the same thing. The signs all said, you know why you're doing this. And I thought, well, that's cool. There's someone around me who knows why he's doing this. Awesome. And then as the miles went by, because did I mention 112 miles? As the miles went by and we saw this sign over and over again, I actually got a little annoyed, and I was like, I want to take this guy out, right? Because I have no idea why I'm doing this. I signed up to go 140.6 miles today, and I have no idea why. And at that moment, I started thinking to myself, like, this could be a problem, because I still have a full marathon to run, right? But it's amazing to me how often in business we get into this kind of a situation where we have no idea why we're doing something. We go on these 3-year-long transformation journeys. Anybody done any of those? Yeah? A little bit of disruption causes that kind of challenge. Or we go into a product launch. It's going to take years, especially in healthcare. It can take decades to bring a new product to market, right? Or we go into a new geography, and it's going to take us months, years to gain traction and to start to build the relationships that we need there. And it can be really easy to lose sight of why we're doing something. There's a couple of reasons why I think this happens. One, we end up with competing priorities. Does this guy look familiar to anyone? Yeah? So, you know, I've done work in a lot of different industries, and this is a very common challenge. I still remember a few years back working with one of the largest credit unions in the United States. And I was asked to come in. They were on one of those 3-year transformations. I was asked to come in and talk to 120 of their high potential leaders in the organization to get an understanding of the impact on the culture and leadership that the transformation was having. And as I went and I talked to all of these different people, I heard a lot of really similar stories. And then I ran into this guy. I'll never forget him. His name was Bill Thompson. He came into the interview, and we were chatting. And as we were talking, he was sinking lower and lower in his chair. And finally, he just said to me, Julie, here's the thing. They keep telling me to do more with less. But I don't think I could do more with more. Anybody ever felt that way? I couldn't do more with more. It's that downward spiral where you just start to feel like you can't even clear the space in your head to know what's most important to work on. We see it organizationally. Just a few weeks ago, I was brought into a client who's a technology provider, and they had just gone through a massive replatforming of their systems and had a miserable failure. Spoiler alert, they don't call me in when it goes well. Somebody do that for me someday, right? Julie, come on in. We had this great migration that just happened. But as we're going through the details and doing sort of a lessons learned, a breakdown, one of the things that became apparent was that organizationally, the customer satisfaction people were incented based on customer sat. The operations people were incented based on uptime and throughput on the system. And the IT people were incented based on hitting their project dates. Those three different incentives made total sense for business as usual. But when they were going through a massive replatforming of their core system that impacted all of their customers, they were actually in conflict with each other. And so in the go, no-go decisions that led up to that go live, a number of pretty bad decisions got made because of how those incentives were pressuring the system. So we run into that situation too. You know what? From an industry perspective, has anybody set up a more competing priorities than healthcare? You've got the triple aim, right? Population health, patient experience, controlling cost. That's pretty interesting, right? In terms of priorities, which one do you do first? So we see this happening all the time. Competing priorities can really sap energy from people. The second thing that we see in the clients that we work with is very limiting assumptions about the business that you're in. Assumptions actually help us, right? They help us to focus. But you get right in that tunnel and you're looking right at the destination and you don't see the tunnel over here or the bridge or the path that you might take. It's hard to see some of the alternatives. One of the most expensive limiting assumptions that I can share with you is an old story. It happened all the way back in 1977. Now, a few things happened in 1977 that were momentous. One is I turned 9 years old. Anybody else turn around 9 years old out there in 1977? Got some peers out there? Yeah, thank you right there. What else happened in 1977? You probably know. Yeah, Star Wars came out, right? Star Wars came out. We all went to the movies and we saw Star Wars for the first time and we heard about a galaxy far, far away. And we walked out of that movie theater, we wanted two things. We wanted to see it again, right? And we wanted lightsabers. The merchandising from Star Wars was phenomenal. Now keep in mind, in 1977, merchandising was not new. Disney had been doing it with great success. TV shows were starting to experiment with it as well. And even comic books were getting into action hero and figures. And you know what? Those little 9 and 10-year-old Gen Xers, we were growing up and we were building the consumer economy that we know today. So there were disruptions happening on the market that indicated that merchandising was a pretty good place to be. But 20th Century Fox was the studio that produced Star Wars, and they were in their tunnel. And their tunnel said, we make movies. And not only that, but we make cost-effective movies. And in making cost-effective movies, what did they do in 1977? They went to George Lucas, who was the director, and they said, hey, for $20,000, how about if we give you the merchandising rights for all Star Wars movies for all time? Hey, so you guys are finance people, you know, if you had invested $20,000 in the S&P 500 in 1977, today you'd have a little over $1 million. What's the value of the Star Wars merchandising franchise? It's in the billions of dollars, right? But they were in that tunnel, they made movies, that's what they did. They did not make merchandise. Pretty sweet deal. So limiting assumptions, they all come into play. The third thing I want to just mention quickly is we also get into working out of habit and not intention. Did you know that the average adult makes about 30,000 decisions a day? Right now, some of you are trying to make a decision about whether you believe me or not, aren't you? Yeah, a couple of you? Okay. It's true, I'm a social scientist. Pretty regularly, we hit around 30,000 decisions a day. Have you ever had that experience where you leave work and you get in your car and you show up at home and you have no idea how you got there? That's habit, my friends. You made a lot of decisions to safely get that steel projectile from your office all the way to your house without hurting anybody. But you made those decisions out of habit, right? There's a lot of habit that's going on there. What happens to us at work when we fall into habit, we answer the same questions in the same way. We respond to customer situations in the same way. We do the same thing over and over. It helps us get through the day, but it also limits our ability to see potential. The best example I can give you of a company that works out of habit and not intention, or that worked, is a client that I worked with about 6 or 7 years ago. They were in the insurance industry, mid to large size insurance company. And the CEO actually was aggravated with all of the bad habits, and he had spun up a program, and it was called Kill So-So. Now luckily, So-So was not a person. Kill So-So was his version of kill same old, same old. He wanted to absolutely get after some of the bad habits in the organization, and I was brought in to help run that program. Now, one of the first things we did is we talked to all of the functional leads in all of the different areas. And I'll never forget going in to sit down with the CFO, a guy named Garrett. He was great. I loved Garrett. He had a great sense of humor for a CFO, wore cowboy boots. He was awesome. Anyway, I sat down with him and I said, Garrett, what kind of project would you like to have as part of the Kill So-So program? He said, Julie, I've got just the project for you. I was like, okay, tell me about it. He said, we have all these spreadsheets, and we use them for everything, for our financial reports, for our board reports, for product analysis. Anytime somebody comes to us, we're in the habit of saying, we'll give you an Excel spreadsheet for that. But a few years ago, I wrote this big check for a little program called SAP, right? So I feel like we should be doing this stuff in SAP. I said, well, Garrett, that sounds like a great project. Let's do it. Let's make that a project for Kill So-So, and we will help you break your Excel habit. He said, Julie, you might want to know just how bad the habit is. And I said, okay, why don't you tell me? He said, we have about 7,000 spreadsheets, all linked together through daisy chains of formulas, and nobody's really sure how they work. And I said, okay, well, Gary, yeah, that's a little bit worse than what I thought, right? I see some smiles. There might be some people thinking, yeah, I could top that. Please don't let me know if you can. So let's take that on. I said, I think you've actually gone from habit all the way to a full-on addiction, right? But what was happening there? They were just in the habit of always saying, yeah, we can do that. We'll do that in Excel. Those kinds of habits really limit our ability to see other ways of doing things, to see some of the really important disruptions that are happening around us, some of the better improvements that maybe our colleagues, our competitors, even our customers are bringing into the market. Because we respond out of habit. It's the easiest thing to do. It's what we're most used to doing. It's what we're most comfortable doing. So when we think about setting competing priorities, limiting assumptions, and working out of habit and not intention, just a quick poll of the audience. How many people out there would say that competing priorities are the biggest challenge for you in your organization out of these three? Got a few hands coming up, yeah? How about limiting assumptions? Who thinks that's your biggest challenge? Got a couple of hands, yeah? How about working out of habit and not intention? Yeah, I think that might be actually the most. So all three of these are problems every day, right? They're kind of normal, everyday business challenges that we face. But when they all come together and you start to experience them at a magnitude that takes you out of any ability to see what's happening in your broader world, we start to see massively missed opportunities. We all know some of the case studies that we've seen most recently. Anybody brought their film down to the drugstore to get developed recently? Right? We just don't do that anymore. Kodak, Radio Shack, BlackBerry, all of these companies are struggling because, or are gone because they had all of these competing priorities. They had limiting assumptions, and they had a lot of habit rather than working out of intention. One of the most recent is Blockbuster, which was fully liquidated in 2013. You might not know the story of Blockbuster. Back in 1997, a guy named Reed Hastings walked into his local Blockbuster store and he returned a copy of Apollo 13 a few days late. And he was charged $40 for that transgression. And he was so annoyed by that he went out and later that year he founded Netflix. Yeah? So he grew Netflix over the next few years, and in 2000, it was a pretty good business. DVDs by mail, no charges. So that was Reed's big thing. And he went to Blockbuster and he said, hey, I've got this business. It's doing pretty well. Would you be interested in buying it? $50 million. And Blockbuster said, no, thank you. Now, legitimately, they had a lot of competing priorities. They were trying to go global. They were changing their store footprint. They were doing some other things locally in the US that had their attention. They also had some very limiting assumptions about the customer experience. They really believed that that process of going to the store and up and down the aisles with your significant other or your family and looking at the DVDs, comparing them, choosing your movie. They were probably VCRs back then. Yeah, but you get the point. Think about it, they had a real assumption that the store experience was very important to their customers. And they were in some pretty interesting habits around finances and how they really looked at their financials. They valued their stores based on movie rentals, product sales. Admit it, you bought the giant box of tamales at least once, right? Yeah, we all did that. And also late fees. And a channel that didn't have two of those three was very difficult for them in terms of how they normally valued revenue and channels. So they passed on that opportunity. We all know the story. By 2007, Blockbuster had peaked at about 9,000 stores, 60,000 employees, about $4 billion in market cap. And by 2013, a short 9 years later, the last of their stores was fully liquidated. They were trapped in that cycle with those three challenges that we just talked about. In the meantime, Netflix has continued to reinvent itself over and over again, and we've seen some really interesting things coming out as a result. So for my colleagues and myself, one of the big questions was, what does it take to be a company like Netflix instead of a company like Blockbuster? How do we break out of these cycles of competing priorities and limiting assumptions and the habits that we all get into? What's the secret sauce of companies that are able to do that on a regular basis? One of the things we found is that companies who are able to routinely look around and understand the disruption and then bring their core capabilities together with that are able to create more value, and they find solutions that matter more. And it's at that intersection of what you do best and what's happening around you that you find that value, that you find that you're able to unlock that. As we think about that intersection, what we're looking at is where you create more value. And as I said, where you create solutions that truly matter more. And if you can envision two intersecting circles, Netflix sort of sits in the middle there. And I think Kodak, Blockbuster, and others, they stayed too far in their core competencies. They got too comfortable there. Other companies are able to stay too far to the right and deep in disruption, but that might not apply to many of you because you still have to be able to produce for your customers today. So finding that intersection is where we were just fascinated with our research to discover what is it that companies do that help with that, that can help them with that. We found about a dozen behaviors. I'm not going to go through all of those today. I'm going to pick three that I think are most important to the healthcare industry today and what you're trying to work on. The first of those behaviors is this ability to see the whole board, to pick your head up and look around and know what's going on more broadly. How many of you flew in today? A lot of people. What do you dread the most when you drive to the airport? Like you're driving to the airport and you think, this is going to be the worst part of my day. It's a security line, right? Like going through TSA, going through security, it's just like such a travesty these days. Did you know there's going to be about 740 million passengers traveling through US airports this year? That's a 97 million passenger increase over last year, about 15%. Here's another stat for you. American Airlines between January and May of this year estimates that 70,000 passengers and 40,000 bags either missed their flights or were delayed because of problems in security screening. That's a lot of people and bags. In one day in May, United Airlines had to cancel or delay 37 flights at O'Hare Airport. That's expensive for United, right? All because of delays in security screening. So it's getting a little bit out of hand. Now, whose problem is that? TSA, maybe, right? That's actually kind of a politically loaded question. Maybe you've heard the conspiracy theories about what's going on there. But in fact, it sort of sits in the TSA purview. But you know what? The company that I'm in love with right now because of what they're doing to help with this is Delta Airlines. You may have seen the news recently, but earlier this year, Delta looked around and they picked their head up and they saw the whole board. They saw this disruption that's happening in the airline industry, and it is, folks, it truly is a disruption. It's negatively impacting the customer experience, but it's also costing the airlines a lot of money. But it's TSA's problem to solve, technically. But Delta looked around and they said, how can we contribute to that? We have a core capability. We're pretty good at moving people from point A to point B. And there's this disruption happening to us. How do we start to get a handle on that? How do we meet at that intersection, that edge of disruption that we've been talking about? Their edge of disruption has been right now to improve the customer experience from the minute you walk in the airport until the minute you get out the other side. How do they do that? Back in April, they made about $1 million investment, and they put about 2 months towards creating what they call innovation lanes. These innovation lanes have a handful of really key improvements over the current TSA process. Then they went to TSA in the Atlanta airport, and they actually launched 2 innovation lanes there. And do you know what they're seeing? 30% more passengers moving through those lanes. Can you imagine if there was a 30% improvement in flow in every lane and every TSA lane at every airport? You might not dread it quite so much as you drive to the airport. Those are the sorts of problems that are so critical for companies to start to embrace, not just the ones that are in their tunnel, not just the ones that are right in front of them, but what's impacting the broader market, the broader value chain, what's impacting your suppliers, your distributors, your customers across the board. And you know what, folks? I think there's no greater place to look for those kinds of opportunities than this sort of conference. You've got great tracks coming up on consumerism, on value-based care, working with physicians to help them to change their model. All sorts of interesting places where you can go look and see the whole board. One of the important things about a conference like this is the opportunity to get to know some other people and to get to know some new topics. And in that spirit, what I'd like to do right now is ask you to turn to your neighbor and take about 3 minutes and just share with them where you feel like you could see the whole board and impact your business today. What are you most interested in all of the things that are going on with healthcare right now? Interoperability, transformation of the industry, the AAA, and whatever it might be. Where are you looking to see the whole board? Share with your neighbor, and then I want to hear from a couple folks in the audience about what you talked about. The second key behavior that I'd like to share with you that we saw consistently among all of the companies that we researched was a genuine desire to co-create solutions. And honestly, folks, I can't think of an industry with bigger opportunities to co-create solutions than healthcare, right? I mean, I think about all of the challenges in healthcare. I think about some of the work GHX is doing with implantables, track and trace for implantables in pharma. I think about things like the triple aim and also adding in a fourth, right, which is let's enjoy what we do. I think about value-based care. All of these things require industry support. Right? It takes more than any one company to solve some of these truly complex problems. So healthcare, I think, is out in front when it comes to the need to co-create, but you're by far not the only industry that has to do it and do it well. One of my favorite case studies that we spent quite a bit of time actually with is a company called Domtar. You may not know Domtar, but you probably use their products. Domtar is a paper company. They make paper. Now, if there's an industry that has been disrupted in the last 15 years, it's got to be paper, right? Think about all of the digital transmission, all of the work to move to paperless billing, paperless society, right? But Domtar has actually been able to remain pretty relevant and through some pretty interesting ways. The paper industry has a well-deserved reputation historically for not being the best of environmental actors. Right? There's a lot of challenge that came out of the early paper mills and how they were going about producing their products. They've done a lot as an industry to try and get better. But they were far from done with that journey. Today they're far from done with that journey, but they have been on a journey to get better, and Domtar has been one of the companies leading the way. Their edge of disruption, where they took their capabilities with the disruptions that were happening in the market, is to create a sustainable future for their industry. But they couldn't do it alone. As a matter of fact, they had some interesting partners. Back in 2006, an ENGO, an environmental non-government organization, think ELF or Greenpeace or the Rainforest Alliance, came to one of their biggest mills, Cromwell, up in Canada, and they dropped an enormous banner over the front of the mill, and they started protesting out in front. Now, Domtar had a choice to make right then and there. They could do what the industry has historically done, and they could call the police, have the protesters removed, spin up the marketing machine, and try and deal with the crisis in that way. Instead, the leadership of Domtar in 2006 made a different decision. They decided that it was time to create that sustainable future. And they actually went out the door literally that day, but they also went out figuratively out the door, and they invited in the people who were most combative with them, the ENGOs. They invited them to the table to co-create a solution for a sustainable future. Today, Domtar produces Earth Choice paper, which you may have seen in Best Buy or Office Max. It is the only paper product like its kind certified by the World Wildlife Foundation, also by the Forest Stewardship Council, as being sustainably produced in their industry. They could not have accomplished that if they had not opened up the doors, not only to the ENGOs, but also to some of their competitors, their suppliers, and their distributors like Best Buy and Office Max, who had to be brought along to be convinced that they could sell an Earth Choice type product. Creating a sustainable future for the paper industry was not any one company's job, nor was it possible for any one company. And they had to partner with some pretty interesting groups in order to accomplish the goal that they've achieved today, which is to have a fully sustainable and recyclable product in the Earth Choice family. So it's a pretty interesting case study. I think, though, that healthcare has some equally interesting and just fascinating opportunities. Again, this is the place, this is the conference, these are the days over the next few days that you have the opportunity to make the connections, to elevate your relationships with the right people, to help you to find the opportunities where you can co-create. So similar to just a minute ago, what I'd love to let you do is take about 3 or 4 minutes, talk with your neighbor, and I would love for you to share with them, where do you have an opportunity to co-create a solution? The third one, I think, is actually the most important and the most interesting. And this behavior we saw consistently across almost every company that we worked with. And that was quite simply to choose optimism. Choose optimism. And people will say to me, oh, Julie, I don't know about that. Like, I'm not an optimistic person, they say. If you're not fundamentally optimistic about what you're doing, then it's very difficult to encourage people to co-create with you. And it becomes very difficult to see the whole board. So all of these things are somewhat reinforcing. But I would also suggest that what we can all learn to do is to ask the optimistic questions. We can learn to ask optimistic questions instead of pessimistic questions. Optimistic questions are the questions that say, how do I work with this? How do I accelerate disruption? How do I go out into my customers, my suppliers, my distributors, and work with them in different ways? How do I move forward? The pessimistic questions are the ones that say, how do I tie this up in litigation so long that they'll forget they ever wanted it? It's the questions that say, how do I stop this? How do I slow it down? How do I prevent my competitors from getting into it before me? Instead of saying, how do I get into it first? So we can all orient ourselves towards these optimistic questions. And ladies and gentlemen, I will tell you that to a T, the companies that we talked with, their leaders always asked the optimistic questions. And I think that's so critically important. The company I'd like to share with you, the case study that we used actually in the book, is a company that's very familiar to all of us. It's Adobe. When I say Adobe, how many of you, the first thing you think is PDF? Yeah, right? When was the last time any of you ever paid for a PDF? Anybody ever wonder how Adobe makes money? Right? Because so many of us, that's all we know them for. But in fact, Adobe has a healthy, thriving business creating creative software, things like Photoshop, a lot of tools for creatives, for marketers to use very effectively in their practice. Back in about 2010, Adobe saw the whole board, and they realized that there were some important changes happening from a technology perspective for their customers and for their customers' customers. Their customers were in the habit, in the process, of buying what's called a perpetual license for software. And you know what? That's the model that we all know. It's where you walk into Best Buy and you buy your software and you take it home and you install it, and you own that software forever. You can do whatever you want with it, except you can't resell it. But other than that, you can do whatever you want with it. It's yours forever. And you don't buy another one until a few years later when you're ready for the new release, and you go back to the store and you buy your CD. So that's how it works. That's the model that Adobe had been in really since its inception for many, many years. What they were realizing is they were being challenged by applications like Instagram. Anybody ever use a filter on Instagram? Come on, I know some of you have used Instagram, right? It's all out there. The ability to manipulate photos is starting to get somewhat commoditized. At the same time, their key clients were needing enhancements and updates and new tools more regularly than every few years, where they were going out and paying actually several $100s for the full Adobe suite every few years. But they needed the tools, they needed the graphics, they needed change more often than that. And something else was happening. Their customers' customers were changing. So the people that these creatives were engaging with wanted to have a more collaborative experience. They wanted to work more closely with the creatives. But they didn't have the capability as creative people to provide that kind of an interface. So they had a problem. And technology was changing. It was becoming possible to distribute software in a very different way. We were starting to hear more and more about this thing called the cloud. So Mark Garnett, who was a CFO at the time, he went to the investment community, and he said what I think was one of the most optimistic things a CFO has ever said. He said in 2011 to his key investors, our stock is going to go down. It's going to go down for a couple of years. And here's why. We are going to get off the perpetual license model. We are going to migrate all of our customers over to a subscription-based model where we have recurring revenue. And that's going to take a few years because we need to retool everything that we have internally around that model. We are not set up today for subscriptions. We're not set up for that kind of migration into production. They weren't that company I mentioned earlier, by the way. But that would be bad. So I think as you think about Mark going to the investment community and saying that, it might not sound optimistic, but in fact, he was setting a vision for the future. He was saying, this is where we're going. We see disruption, and we're going to run right at it because we are asking the optimistic questions. We are asking, how do we accelerate this? How do we get ahead of it? How do we meet our customers where they are? And in that process, sure enough, 2012, 2013, Adobe went from being a pretty sleepy mid-$30 stock. It dipped down into the 20s, and it started to just sort of languish there. But around 2013, 2014, something happened. They had gone through all of the migration with their customers. They had moved them onto this new model. And now instead of having customers who every few years were spending a few $100s, they now had thousands of customers who every month were spending about $40 on their software. They had migrated them into this recurring revenue, subscription-based service. And in doing so, by 2014, their stock was back up to their normal levels. And in 2015, it went up to about 60 or 70. And do you know, earlier this year, it actually hit $100 a share. So they more than tripled their stock as a result of asking that incredibly optimistic question of how do we accelerate this disruption, and having the courage to go to the investment community and say, this is a very optimistic position for us to take, and you're going to have to go on this journey with us. I would put to you that in your own business, there are probably opportunities to ask questions differently. And I'm going to give you a few minutes to share with your neighbor one more time. What are some of the optimistic questions that you should be asking? And what are some of the pessimistic questions that you should stop asking? Before we wrap up, I just want to tell you what happened during my Ironman. You remember I did an Ironman? Yeah, it took me 15 and a half hours to finish. That's a long day. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah. Here's the thing. I didn't have the language for it back then, but I honestly believe that I had found my own personal edge of disruption. I mentioned to you that I was working with some incredibly complex and challenging clients, and I was trying to write my dissertation. I was the dreaded ABD. Anybody else out there ever been ABD? It's horrible, right? You don't want to be ABD, all but dissertation very long. So I had all of these things going on, and my research agenda was very qualitative. I was always out talking with people. At the same time, those were the disruptions that were happening. I am fundamentally an introvert. I love being up here on stage talking with all of you, but for me to really process and to really think things through carefully, I need time on my own. That's my core capability. That's how I best deliver solutions to very complex problems. I need time and space to think that's quiet. And I'm convinced that those long bike rides and those long runs that I was engaged in through the Ironman training gave me the headspace to really find my way through the complexities of my dissertation and the complexities of my clients that year, which were on kind of a collision course with each other and creating a lot of chaos in my life. So I found my own personal edge of disruption. And I'd encourage all of you to think about for yourself, Where's your edge of disruption? Not just for your organization, but for you personally. You might have a situation where the career path that you've been on for the last 5, 10, 15 years is having disruption. It's shifting, it's changing. Maybe your organization structure has changed and that job you thought you were working for isn't there anymore. Or maybe technology is coming in and disrupting the skill sets that you've had. How do you take who you are and what you do best and ask those optimistic questions? Who do you engage to discuss? Where else can you be going personally? How do you look out and see the whole board for yourself? I believe that when you find your own edge of disruption, you can truly thrive there. And I think about the theme for HFMA for the next year about thrive, and it's such a rich word, such a great word. And I really believe that we all thrive when we find our edge of disruption and we work from there, rather than working too far over in our core capabilities or too far out in disruption where everything is chaos and it's chaotic. So my request to you as you go forward is if you decide to go in pursuit of your own personal edge of disruption or for your organization, let me know how it goes. I would love to chat. Reach out anytime. And if you ever decide to do an Ironman, let me know. I will share some training tips and we can maybe even talk about why. Thank you very much. I hope you have a great conference. I look forward to maybe meeting you at the Relay Health station.